Ja, guten Morgen. Good morning. Good to have you all here. Für die beiden Keynotes wechseln wir jetzt auf Englisch. Wir haben internationale, auch deutsch sprechende Gäste, aber beide Keynotes werden auf Englisch gehalten. Sie können aber zumindest heute auch gerne Fragen auf Deutsch ausartikulieren. Und Elena kann wahrscheinlich besser darauf antworten als ich auf Deutsch. Oder auf Englisch, wie Sie wollen. Die Keynote und aber auch jetzt meine Anmoderation werden auf Englisch sein. So now I'm switching to English for the keynote. I'm very happy to host and welcome Elena Esposito here for our first keynote on how to communicate with machines that do not understand. With both keynotes, I think we will address kind of those fundamental questions that Andreas already introduced with regard to communication and media. I believe today we will talk a bit more about communication, and maybe tomorrow we will question a bit more what is media in that age. So I'm very happy and honored to have now that role to host and introduce Elena Esposito for her keynote. Elena is professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Bielefeld and at the Department of Political Science and Social Sciences at the University of Bologna. And we are especially lucky to have you, despite those weather and flooding catastrophes in your regions currently, to today sunny Prim. Elena is a sociologist with a training and high reputation in sociological systems theory with Niklas Luhmann and long-standing track record on theories of society, media and communication theories, memory theory, and the sociology of prediction and future. She's currently leading an ERC advanced grant project, Predict, the Future of Prediction, the Social Consequences of Algorithmic Forecast in Insurance, Medicine, and Policing. And when Elena and I met the last time, actually the first time, that was in 2018, and I had invited you to a lecture on future and uncertainty in Berlin. Her article on artificial communication had just been published a few months before, and her ERC project, Predict, was also about to start. And in that lecture, Elena made it pretty clear that futures are very hard to predict. She said, our open future does not yet exist. It's like a horizon that always moves. And drawing on Luhmann and Koselleck, I believe, you made it pretty clear that you just cannot know the future, just like you can never reach the horizon. You can only know the present image of the horizon. Yet Elena was pretty foresighted herself at the time. And now, although yesterday we have already been warned, and Andreas also preached that already, about ChatGPT references at this conference. I need to plug another one now because it's just too on point. Because Elena is probably one of the persons the least surprised about the emergence and the public appeal and concern also with regard to ChatGPT. She was so foresighted more than 5 years ago that she already delivered, I believe, the best explanation for the now all-present ChatGPT that obviously didn't exist in that form back then. So it was in many ways avant la lettre what she's been saying back then. She writes in this article from 2017, what is interesting in the interaction with algorithms is not what happens in the machine's artificial brain, but what the machine tells its users and the consequences of this. The problem is not that the machine is able to think, but that it is able to communicate. The reference to communication and social context is the central issue. And I believe that we all here kind of buy this argument with communication being at the core. We might not so easily be sold to the next sentence of that article, so being at the annual conference of the German Communication Association. The next sentence goes like this: sociology is the discipline to deal with this. But such controversies within disciplines are exactly what we need, I believe. So yet another reason why we're so happy to have you here. And in your new book, Artificial Communication, How Algorithms Produce Social Intelligence, published in 2022 with MIT Press, Elena has expanded and developed this perspective, including, I believe, just one thing that I would like to highlight here, many other things as well, but one to highlight, including the observation that we as humans also change in this interaction. She writes, if machines contribute to social intelligence, it will not only be because they have learned how to think like us, but because we have learned how to communicate with them. And now your lecture is no longer at the horizon that have been looking at and yearning for the whole morning, but it's becoming the present. Elena, we are very looking forward to your lecture, and the floor is yours.
Test. Okay. Okay, thank you. Well, thanks so much for the invitation, for so kind introduction. And I have to say, most things have already been said. So I have to refer to what I said in the first talks and what Christian kindly said, and try to develop a little more. And luckily, you see, the initial title of my talk has been changed, and I'm referring to ChatGPT because it's sort of unavoidable today. And I will try to address from, well, sociological perspective, but sociology in the way I do sociology with system theory is a communication theory, basically. We can talk about it, but the two disciplines are overlapping, so I don't feel like a contradiction being here as a sociologist and talking about the central role of communication in society. But I want to talk now about the topic of ChatGPT and what has been addressed right now. The question that's not only in academic circle, but everywhere is asked today, whether ChatGPT and generative AI in general constitute what have been said, well, they can be welcomed or feared, but basically everyone, as you heard now, agree that this new development constitute, I quote here, a profound change in the history of life on Earth. This is a quote from the famous open letter of many people, thousands of research, including Elon Musk and so on, that has been published a couple of months ago. And there's a huge resonance in the media. But also there are many other voices voicing similar concern. I think, for example, the Yuval Harari in the New York Times that said, I quote here, that this new development could hack the foundation of our civilization. And this is what I want to talk about. Is it really something you have to worry about? Many people are worried, and as you said, Jeffrey Hinton, and there are articles by Noam Chomsky, Eric Schmidt. So many people are deep into the field, are deeply worried about that. So what I want to discuss with you is really how much do we have to worry? And are we worrying about the right things? That was me as a sociology concerns more. And where can we find an orientation? Or since we are meeting here today, most importantly, what do sociology and communication theory has to say about these new developments? And that's refers to the, opening image to see in the talk here, because we know as communication theorists that our civilization already faced a similar challenge once before, and I think we can learn something from this past experience. I'm talking about, that more than 2,000 years ago, where the introduction of alphabetical writing in ancient Greece was seen as a similar revolution. Actually, was a similar revolution, raising the same amazement as we can perceive now, and the same fears. And interesting, almost exactly with the same words. You see Plato here. I went back to one of the most read and commented upon texts in Western civilization, Plato's Phaedron, that you see here. And the image has been produced by Stable Diffusion. I give the prompt, Plato worried about the future, and that's what the generative AI produced here. Because, it's my project, because if you read the text, it's clear that Plato was already deeply worried about exactly the same things that worry us now, about entrusting to an external support the fundamental faculty that defines human being, which for Plato was memory. Of course, it was the oral culture, alphabetic writing was coming in, and there was a huge worry, because in an oral culture, the fundamental contents and elements of civilization were located in human minds, in human memories, the human capacity to memorize and to remember. And as Plato wrote, by consigning context to writing, as we actually do since 2,000 years now, which, I quote, proceeds by means of external marks, not in our mind, but external, outside, and not to the process of our human mind, he thought this fundamental capacity, which defines us as human beings, would be lost forever. Delegated to tools, that's a quote from Plato, that talk as they were intelligent, but in fact they know nothing. That, I think, resonates with something we know very well today. No? The spread of writing, there was a worry, would lead to the loss of human primacy, singularity, these kind of things, and over our control over the fundamental content of our civilization. And I think in this and other sentences, we can see that Plato's argument is replicated almost literally in today's debate and alarm about ChatGPT. He said that if you question technologies, you ask questions about these technologies, writing his time, ChatGPT in our time, they do not create any genuine novelty, but only repeat what is already known. Like our stochastic parrot, we hear every day, ChatGPT and generative AI are not creative, a stochastic parrot, repeat what we already know. That was what Plato was saying. They seem to be intelligent, but actually do not understand the content that they produce, which is true, by the way. And also written text, according to Plato, like our algorithms, are not based on discourse, he said, written in the soul, in our mind, in our consciousness. And therefore, he said, that's the threat, they tend to drift all over the place, getting into the hands not only of those who understand them, but also of those who have no business with it. Well, with huge risk, he said, which are huge and difficult to assess. Also today, we know the greatest concern are, we heard it in the previous speeches, threats of misinformation, deep fakes, when messages reach people who do not have the appropriate tools to assess the accuracy and reliability of the communication. So that might be curious. I find it sort of interesting, but the question is, what can we learn now from Plato, more than 2,000 years after that? I would say that in hindsight, we can say that Plato was absolutely right and completely wrong at the same time. And that can be interesting for us, because none of us can memorize long and complex works like the Iliad and the Odyssey. Nobody can do that now for many reasons. They were oral compositions that were remembered by immersing oneself in the context and were recreated time after the time over again without reproducing a written text. You know, the research Havelock, Ong, this kind of studies of literacy, about the literacy, they shown it in a very convincing way. So this ability to remember was lost forever. Plato was completely right. We cannot get it anymore. That's really gone. But Plato was wrong at the same, oh, sorry, I forgot it. Yeah. But at the same time, we know that Plato was wrong when he said that memory would be lost, because we know also that we have a much stronger memory in our society, because writing, having written records of contents, enables our society to have at our disposal a much bigger amount of content stored in books, which is our society can remember much more. The difference, and that's a crucial difference, is that memory now is no longer located in the human mind, but in the communication through books and other media. And that's the big differences. So that's why I think that what we can learn from this, that Plato's error was to refer to evaluate the effect of writing in general, referring to human intelligence rather than to communication. And today, facing the concept of generative AI, as the previous talk already sort of hinted at, I think we must not make the same mistake. We must, I think, change our perspective, moving from notion of artificial intelligence to praxis of artificial communication, like the title of this conference hints to. And that's something that, as already been said, that didn't begin with ChatGPT. AI programmers, especially people working in machine learning, know since quite a long time, at least 10, 15 years, that these recent algorithms, which were already amazing before ChatGPT, which made the topic so known to everyone, machines work in machine learning and big data, do not try to mimic the forms of human intelligence anymore. I have a collection of quotes from people in programming. The biggest say, that's a quote, "We don't try to copy intelligence. It would be too heavy a burden, and we don't need it. People don't try to reproduce the forms of our intelligence. They do something completely different." Now everybody knows how the machine looks, how the programmer teach the machines to learn. They look for patterns and regularity in the huge amount of data they have at their disposal, this big data that's interesting because of that. No? And use this pattern to produce text and materials that they make sense to us, what ChatGPT gives us, or Stable Diffusion and so on. The result makes sense to us, but not to the algorithms. The algorithms understand nothing about the content that they process, and they don't need to. They don't try to understand it. They work so well since the programmers explicitly decided not to try to make the machine understand the content it's working on. Andreas already mentioned the translation programs. We know it very well. I remember when translation programs were well, sort of funny, but not so long ago, 15 years ago. You Google Translate, produce results that, yeah, okay, we use them, but we also make a lot of jokes about that. And now Deep Translate, I use it every day. It's amazing. The text is fantastic. I learn from Deep Translate better how to translate my text from Italian to English, but the machine is amazing. There's some little slips once in a while, but the result is really remarkable. No? And this happens explicitly since programmers said that they changed their attitude. They stopped trying to teach algorithms different languages, the role of the languages. The algorithm don't know the language. The algorithm translated from Chinese into English or into German doesn't know English. And the programmers who plan the algorithm don't know English either. They work in a completely different way. Of course, they just look for regularity in a huge amount of multilingual text that they found on the web, and they used to produce translation that work for us, not for the machines. And that's a point which is quite well known. Even the critics of ChatGPT and similar things agree with that. Noam Chomsky, who just wrote a terrified article in New York Times about the threats of ChatGPT, says, I quote, "These programs differ profoundly from the way humans reason and use language." And I agree. But for Chomsky, which like for most of the critics, this indication the machines are flawed. The machines are not intelligent, that they are stupid. And my point, the machines are neither stupid nor intelligent. They do something completely different. And in my opinion, the difference from human form of processing, the fact that machines are not intelligent like we are, is not a weakness, but the very root of the success of these technologies. They work so well because they don't try to be intelligent. So from this perspective, the success of ChatGPT and generative AI in general is, in my understanding, not the realization of artificial intelligence, not the moment where after 50 years we finally were able to reproduce human intelligence in machines, but rather the signal that we should abandon this approach. We need a different approach, no more referring to artificial intelligence. That's why I propose to move from the metaphor of artificial intelligence to that artificial communication, which has been said. And I will try to say a little more about that from the perspective of us, people working in communication theory. So machines, we heard it from Christian, have not learned to become intelligent, but to do something else that we might do with intelligence. They've learned to participate in communication. And here I have to disclose what I mean with communication. I refer to Niklas Luhmann's concept of communication, which many of you probably know, which I think is particularly useful to deal with what we are observing today. Because according to Luhmann's concept of communication, communication does not presuppose any sharing of thoughts among the participants. For example, this communication, I trivialize a little. This communication works if it succeeds. It's not because you are thinking the same things that I have in mind. And fortunately, you don't need to read my thoughts. They're not sharing of thought. It doesn't require that you understand what I'm thinking about, luckily. So my thoughts are and remain mine alone. Communication doesn't require that. The successful communication requires only that each of you uses what I say to produce your own thoughts and your own information, which depend on your specific perspective, of your biography, of your perspective or your interests, which are of course different from mine and from the one of everyone else. So your thoughts, again, are yours alone. And communication works like this, producing different thoughts in different participants according to their different perspective. A communication, the miracle of a communication, is making that possible. So in this view, algorithms that do not think can still act as communication partners. If they have the ability, what we try to observe now with the new tools, to produce contributions, communicative contributions, that enable us, we, intelligent human, to produce our own and interesting relevant information by participation in communication. So they don't need to think, they need to produce something that allows us to think and produce information. So they don't need to understand information in order to produce meaningful information and to make it circulate in communication, what they are doing now. So that's why, going back to our initial question, do we have to worry about ChatGPT? Yes, we do have to worry, but not because of the much discussed idea that ChatGPT and the similar generative AI are a human competitive intelligence. Human competitive intelligence is written this open letter about OpenAI, about regulation of AI. Or, as Harari said, not worry because we are producing an alien mind that could make us obsolete and replace our intelligence, like superintelligence, Bostrom, or singularity, Kurzweil, and so on. This worry, in my opinion, is baseless. That's not what keeps me awake at night. It simply doesn't happen in my understanding. And with it, also all the terrifying idea about machines rebelling, following their own desires, their will to be autonomous, to be powerful. That looks terrible, but I don't think that's a realistic thing to worry about. But still, what we discussed, there's nothing to fear. Therefore, the machine is not becoming autonomous. I think there's a lot that we have to be worried about, quite the contrary. But I would shift the perspective, because precisely because generative AI intervenes in communication, we have to be very worried about the effects of ChatGPT and similar tools in communication. Or to put this in a question, if algorithms work differently from human mind and often incomprehensibly for us, because it has not been mentioned up now, but many of these machines are deeply intransparent. Intransparent not only for me, I don't even understand how my coffee machine works, but they are deeply transparent even for the people who program them. The programmers of machine learning, they say they don't understand how the machine that they designed works and understand the procedure. And that's something that is required. Machine works so well because they are intransparent. So you have to face the basic, unavoidable intransparencies of these advanced tools. How do we deal with that? Knowing also that not only they are intransparent, but as huge media theory pointed to, they are biased. These machines are biased in many, many levels, in many different ways, and again, unavoidably biased, because using big data which are biased, the machines are biased. It's unavoidable. How do we deal with that? And that's the question that I think we have to explore. Not the stupidity or intelligence of the machine, because ChatGPT and generative intelligence is neither intelligent nor stupid. But this is the challenge, not the solution. And I would like to say a couple of things about that. First of all, let's start from ChatGPT. And I think that especially ChatGPT mistakes are a good demonstration of the way the machine works. We can learn from these mistakes. You probably have read of the so much discussion of ChatGPT with Kevin Roose, a journalist from the New York Times. It has been reported everywhere. So this journalist, I think now more than a month ago, had a long interaction with Sydney, which is the experimental version of a Microsoft chatbot using ChatGPT. And at the end of this conversation, Sidney declared his love for Kevin Roose and tried to convince him there's a problem with his wife and said a lot of crazy things. That's been really, really very much discussed. And that's been interpreted as a mistake of ChatGPT. Of course, it's not the result that we want, but we have to understand, is it a mistake or something else? How do we interpret that from the point of view of communication ability of these machines? Actually, if you read the transcript, which is very interesting, can be found on the website of the New York Times, this happened after hours of intense communication between Kevin Roose and the machine, where Kevin Roose took an interest in the feeling of the machine, how the machine feels, how it works, how it's a perspective about the world, how it's personal and personal interest and the feeling of the machine and so on. After hours of this conversation, the algorithm, which, as we know, is communication-oriented. The goal of the algorithm is to produce communicative, meaningful outcomes. And always tries to respond in the way that is meaningful for its communication partner. So after hours of this conversation, the algorithm inferred that there was emotional involvement with the machine and acted correspondingly. From this point of view, the machine declaring its love to Kevin Roose makes perfect sense. It's not good, it has to be fixed, but makes perfect sense. It's not a mistake of the machine. But it is, of course, a problem that has to be fixed, but the problem has nothing to do with intelligence. It's a problem about communication. And in fact, all the measures proposed by Microsoft to counter these undesirable outcomes are communicative measures, not cognitive measures. They don't act on the way the machine works, but for example, they intervene in the allowed duration of communication. They said the communication could be no longer than 20 minutes now, so you don't get these crazy developments. Or on the topics that can be addressed. You cannot talk about personal issues and so on. But there's nothing to do with the intelligence of the machine. It's just how you structure the communication between us and generative AI. And this is an example of the ones that I think, and even Sam Altman of ChatGPT, of OpenAI, declared in many interviews, which are now the main important problems about generative AI. They are alignment problems, which are really hard to solve. How do we get machine learning algorithms to do what we want them to do, and to do them in a way that we would approve? Because if systems obey us, which they do, and they do it without understanding what we have in mind, there's also the danger they do something really strange. The danger, I quote from Sam Altman, the danger that what we want the system to do and what they will actually do could diverge. For example, there's an example, an algorithm was asked to book a table in a restaurant, which is really, really quiet, and the algorithm booked the table, at the same time made it impossible to anyone else to book a table in the same restaurant, so it will be quiet. So it fulfills this task, but it's not the way we want to do that. And you look on the web, there are many, many examples of alignment problems, like to optimize the ride-sharing service, the algorithm might end up exacerbating traffic congestion in certain areas. They do what they are asked to do, but in a way that we don't expect and not the way we want them to work. This is a huge area of research where I think the competence of people working on communication is really needed. But of course, there's the other huge area of research, which has been mentioned before, where also our competence is required, the problems of the effect of generative AI on public debate and on democracy. This is, by the way, the main worry that led Geoffrey Hinton quit Google. You heard that. Because he said his alarm about that this system, they allow the models that learn separately, the different machine learning algorithms, to share their knowledge instantaneously. So I quote from the interview with Geoffrey Hinton when he left Google for this reason. He says, what worries him is a condition where it is as if one person could transfer what they know to 10,000 others in an instant. But this, well, we are communication theory, we are media theorists. That's, that's exactly what media communication has been doing for a long time. For us, it's nothing new. The question is how to deal with that. And this is where the great challenge of misinformation and fake news arises. And here, that's where the expertise of us, of people researching journalism and communication theory, becomes central. And on that, I would like to make a few points, concluding my talk here. First, deepfakes. That's, of course, a huge concern with many, many reasons. There's this widespread and justified concern that generative AI could be used to easily, quickly, and most of all, cheaply produce and circulate news that seem plausible, but are actually baseless, so fake news. And deepfakes, exactly. And the worry, if you read the debate, is about something we heard about truth. The worry that this circulation of baseless or fake news will blur the distinction between true and false in the reception and circulation of news. And this distinction is, in our discourse, we know that, is the basis of construction of public opinion and of modern democracy, as we know is since the late 18th century, Habermas, Öffentlichkeit, and so on. You have to trust the media on that. But we know also, we scholars working on media, especially mass media, we know that the criterion for news has never been the distinction between true and false. And that is known and debated from the end of the 17th century. In the end of the 17th century, when the serial production of news first began, the debate was just about that, about true and false content of the media. The realization that news that are produced and distributed in an organized way somehow must be hoax. There's something strange about them. And the evidence at the time was seen in the fact that events in the world are never produced in such a regular rhythm corresponding to the output of the media. I mean, every day in the same quantity at the same hour to feed the same number of pages the newspaper. That's not how things happens. In this debate, the regularity of the production of the news coming out as an organized system, so was seen as an evidence of that not being true. That's, I think it makes sense. We know it now since then. According to Luhmann, news production is not driven by the distinction between true and false, but the distinction between what's interesting and what is not interesting. We know many true events don't make news, and many falsehoods might make news. That's not the point of true or false in the news. There are other kinds of controls that check how news are produced. And here I refer, you know it very well, the work of newsmaking has explored since many, many years now, at least since 50 years. And they've shown from decades that the news are not a window to the world and should not even be that. That's not the task of the news, not why the reason why they are useful. Rather, the function of the news is in constructing their own world, news making, their own world that becomes the reference word of public opinion with its own benchmarks, newsworthiness criteria. They are very rigid, and they decide what gets into the news and makes the news a structure which is not at all arbitrary, but not because they are true or they respect the word. The word of the news, the words, for example, you know it very well. New York is much closer to us than Chisinau in Moldavia or Khartoum, which are physically much closer to Germany, or Lady Gaga, a much more prominent of Franz Walter Steinmeier or our president Sergio Mattarella. That's the word of the news with its own criteria, which we know or know very well. So the mass media do not tell us the events of the world, which are too many and largely uninteresting to the public, but the news. And news that the mass media themselves make, news making, and share, and which everyone is expected to know. We expect everyone to know what the news divulge. This is, of course, a huge power. A huge power which is controlled. The mass media, traditional mass media, exercises power following their criteria and with precise controls since some centuries now. That's a problem with generative AI, because the generative AI tools are not bound by these rules, and they're not bound by professional competence of the ethic of journalists. and work in a completely different way from journalists. In particular, algorithm, as I quote again, but this was something where everybody knows, the algorithms don't know if what they are generating is true or false. That's not their task. So that's the problem that I think ChatGPT and similar media pose today. What criteria, what controls can be effective when news circulating on the web can be produced by automated programs? And on that, we are really not equipped yet. But the problem is broader and deeper than the truth or falsity of the news. Lev Manovich, for example, says that generative media complicate the binary opposition we are used to refer to. This is shown, I think, by the most feared threat of generative AI, which is not a false, it is a fake. And the false take is something really different. The idea that the news conveyed by these tools are not incorrect information, untrue information, that happens. But what raises our attention more is that, that they don't say something false about reality, but they give information about the fictional world, fictional reality that they produce themselves. Tools like Del-I, Stable Diffusion, which produce my little Plato image, or Midjourney, can create, we know that, can create from description and natural language, realistic image of objects or of people that do not exist, or even completely realistic images or videos of people who exist, but never did the things that are shown in the videos. And on this, I will, how much time do I have still? 5 minutes? Okay, good. So I think the issue is really serious, but again, this alarm is not completely new. And here again, I think communication studies is something very important to say. Because we know it's not new, because we had something very similar when the printing press spread and gave rise to newspaper. When newspapers were diffusing, also the printing press produced a completely new way of dealing with distinction between what is real and what is fake. And at the time, it was not deep fakes, but the previously complete unknown realm of fiction. Here, you know, the debate, I refer to fiction in novels. Books like Robinson Crusoe by Defoe or Richardson Pamela, which are hugely discussed at the time because they are completely different from early narratives. Previous narratives, of course, there were narratives since ever, but they always referred in an often very unrealistic way to historical figures such as Knights of the Round Table or saints or heroes, figures that really existed, but what they produced, think about Astolfo going to the moon, were completely unrealistic narration about historical real figures. Modern novels fiction does something completely different because, you know, modern novels tell invented stories about ordinary people, not sense of heroes, people like us who never existed, and are presented explicitly as being invented by the author, but nevertheless are not lies. They are fictions, which, or if you want, fakes, which is something different from lies. And therefore, in the 18th century, very similar to what we are observing now, there was a huge debate about the threats, the danger of this production of fictions. The idea that there could be a confusion between reality and fiction resulting from reading novels, especially at the time the debate was about women. Women who are impressional, easily impressed, should not read novels. Think about Madame Bovary and other examples. And then this worry basically faded away because later, when reading novel became a widespread practice, like everyone died, the debate died out. Because actually, if you think about it, since century, each of us has developed a very clear skill in discriminating and combining reference to real reality and to reality of fiction. So we know very well, for example, that Sherlock Holmes is not French or that Mickey Mouse is not a dog and so on. The world of fiction has its own criteria, which are very rigid, very precise, but we don't confuse them with real reality. We are able to distinguish fictional reality and real reality. And we are able to handle the difference confidently. The point is not that it's something irrelevant. It's a crucial skill because the experience that we make in the fictional world affect later our ability to navigate the real world. Without experience in fiction, we would never have the ability to understand how the real world, how to build our ambition, our hopes, our threat, our way to relate with people, we are deeply trained by experience in fiction. Umberto Eco wrote, I quote, that fiction is a basic model of the knowledge we have of the world. So I think what we can think about it today when we have a similar concern about the blurry distinction between reality and fiction in regard to generative AI. I think that the issue is a little more complex as a debate in the general discourse, because think about the hallucination of algorithms that are one of the things that makes us more worried. So the instance in which generative AI produces answers that are completely made up, inventing people, events, bibliography reference that never existed really. They just figure out something. These communications, if you think about it, are interesting because they're not mistakes, again. They correctly result from the way the machine works. The machine are not supposed to understand, we said, they're supposed to communicate, to give an answer to our request. And Margaret Mitchell, program in the field, explains, I quote, that these systems are not trained to predict facts. They are trained to make up things that look like facts. So they're trained to give always an answer on the basis of the available data that they have. So they might guess an answer on the basis of the information that they have, not figure out whether this answer is true or false. So hallucinations are not mistakes, are just extreme dysfunctional result of the way the algorithm works. But they're interesting because they reveal us how the algorithm works. And these hallucinations are being fixed now, but they give us an idea of the way of what the path the algorithm follow in producing our answers. So therefore, they're not mistakes, but if you think about it, they're also not lies, because the machine don't intend to tell us things that are not true. People use the algorithm might, but the algorithm themselves not. And they're also not fictions, because fiction are explicitly presented as such, as invention by the author, and this fake news not. So there's something new. And that's, I think, interesting for us, because we might say that as fiction led us to develop a more refined ability to discriminate between different forms of non-reality, truth, lies, fiction, and so on. So we might expect generative AI maybe to force us to deal with the novel ways of producing information from available information. That's what these tools do, actually. And this requires specific checking criteria, and that, of course, have to be produced. Like the criteria of the news didn't exist at the beginning, were produced while we were using these tools. And that's why the debate about regulation of generative AI is widespread. Nobody knows how to regulate it, but the European Union, the Congress of the United States, China, and so on, everybody's trying to find criteria that work, but we don't know exactly now how they should be implemented. And again, this is something on which communication theorists are really useful. There are, for example, now already teams of teachers, for example, at MIT and the Columbia, that work on AI systems that should not just provide answer, but help people develop critical thinking skills with the help of algorithms, not the opposite. So I close now, but that's to say, I don't mean to say that we don't have to, there's nothing to worry about fake news. There's a lot to worry about fake news. But I think the social management of the true and false ideas is more complex than what we read in the current debate. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Elena, for this inspiring keynote. I imagine there's a lot of questions. I at least have a very long list myself, but I give the word first to the audience. There's microphones. As I said, questions can be asked in German and in English, whatever you prefer. So just raise your hand and then we'll bring the microphone to you so that everyone can hear you well. Cornelius?
Yes, thank you very much. I thought it was really exciting how you noted that machines can communicate without understanding, and making the point regarding the distinction between communication and intelligence. As someone studying social media a lot, I was wondering whether the fact that communication as conducted by large language models, so communication that's sort of a pantomime maybe of communication of two conscious entities to some extent, or at least can be, is something that has particularly dangerous implications in relation to social media or with other digital contexts where communication is often sort of not really, doesn't have a lot of turns, doesn't necessarily evolve into something that looks very conversational, but can be very one-sided. And this seems to me to fit especially well with something that, you know, is not conscious, but that communicates without understanding anything. Maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Do you have an example of that?
Just for example, thinking of say Twitter or other social media platforms where exchanges are often very short and where there's not that much necessarily of an evolution within a conversation, an exchange of arguments necessarily, and that seems to me to, you know, fit with large language models in a particularly potentially dangerous way, because if engagement is such an important part of social media platforms, and engagement is rewarded, people responding or clicking on something are sort of rewarded in the logic of social media. This seems something that is easily manipulable, can be easily manipulated more easily than, say, you know, some long sort of the conversation that Kevin Roos had, you know, there it becomes perhaps more apparent that something is not in fact.
No, I see the point. Now, of course, I see that's a huge problem in the way they are circulated in the social media. But well, actually, as far as I can follow the debate about the chatbots, on the malicious chatbots and this kind of problem, the big part of the result, there's even a botometer who has been developed to disclose if the machine is a human being or not. No? And I think the problem is that the problem is not so much that the machine, just declare I'm a machine and do things. They don't necessarily say I'm a human being, but they act as they were. So I think the problem, again, is not technical, it's communicational. So how we receive these things, how we produce them. And then that, when you talk with ChatGPT, your interaction partner is ChatGPT in a sense. No? While in the social media, the interaction partner is social media community. And these bots produce input in this communication that acts in the communication, because that the response react to that and becomes sort of a mixed thing between human beings and communication, that at the end, if there were only chat bots discussing with each other, we wouldn't really care. Even at the end, the problem is to have something at the end, there's something receiving it and understanding it and sort of drawing consequences from that. And there's something of which we are not really prepared to deal with. Because myself, I'm not particularly worried about chatbots intervening in communication. I'm worried about manipulative effect, and the manipulation is not from the chatbot itself, it's from someone else. I will not say manipulation is not a problem, but my impression, we have to deal with the problem in a different way than we're used to.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I really appreciate the way you framed it in terms of saying we're worried about the wrong things and pointing in the directions of some things to worry about. One thing that really worried me a lot was this notion of using generative AI to teach critical thinking. I think that's a really fraught endeavor in some ways. And I'll suggest a comment and then see what your thought is about that. I was struck by the use of the term hallucination, and as you know, that's been discussed or debated. You know, what does it mean to imply that these things hallucinate? And hallucination brings with it a kind of connotation of something that's also not hallucination. You know, at this moment it's not hallucinating but now it's hallucinating, and maybe what's really going on is it's just hallucinating all the time. I'm not sure that there's a distinction between it's non-hallucinating and hallucinating. So it's like pure hallucination. And that leads to the question of, you know, how to think about why it's hallucinating or what the function of its hallucinating is. And I suspect the function is, in some sense, a kind of, we'd have to think about how these things are programmed and shaped, but they're kind of probes to see whether or not it achieves whatever parameters it's supposed to achieve most effectively. So, so the question is, what are some ways you think it might be possible, or is it indeed possible to use a hallucination machine where, if we understand everything it does is hallucination, to teach critical thinking? That's one thing that worries me. Yeah.
You're perfectly right. I agree completely. So the things that we have to, well, first, hallucinations. I agree very much what you said. In my understanding, I say that the machine hallucinates all the time. They're always hallucinating, but sometimes the product of its hallucination is simply doesn't fit. When it goes something that said, well, people say, or your experiment too, that you write about ask to tell you some information about the topic and gives information that are wrong, or even more interesting, gives you very plausible reference to text which never existed. That will be fixed, of course, because now we see where the machine makes mistakes. I think in a very short time, the problem will be fixed, so we don't see it anymore, and we give us only references that are right. And if you ask reference about a very well-known book or very topic, that becomes a right reference. If you ask reference about yourself, which is not really so famous, it comes to crazy things. No? But so my impression is they always hallucinate. Well, how we understand hallucination, we need a definition of that, but it's something which doesn't correspond to doesn't refer to the reality, to the reference between true and false, or real and not real. Hallucinations are something, they look completely real, but they are not. So, and the machine always do that because the distinction between true and false for them is not relevant. The question is, how do we make of that? And I think the interesting point, what interests me particularly, is that these are tools that allow us to get new information from already existing information. And that has to be regulated. They don't refer to the word. They refer only to the information available. And what they gave to us is correct way of dealing, and they have no reference to the word at all, to get a new information from the already existing one, which is, of course, completely correct if you want to have a textual reference. It's like a very, very powered catalog of the library, or they only tell you what is there. We need to have tools to deal with that, to be able to understand it. The critical thinking, I completely agree with you. That's American thing. What they understand with critical thinking, but I think what the way they say is simply train people to distinguish in a better way whether the algorithm is, whether the news is fake or not. And there are ways to deal with that. And probably the way will be, there's a debate now, having some tools that when it's relevant, declare it is fake. But it's not always relevant. In many cases, I don't really care. If I read the instruction of my dishwasher, I don't care if it's produced by a bot. So it's not fake in this sense. No? But in some cases, it might be useful, and then we need a regulation of deals with that. And that's critical thinking, which means, yeah, as we learned in the last century to distinguish things that you look at a movie, and you know perfectly well that it never existed. The things that a fictional story that you read, you cry, you laugh, you learn how to deal with life, but you are perfectly aware that the character never exists, they're completely invented, but they still have consequences in our life. It's not irrelevant. But we learned to deal with that, and they required a training that our society has had for some centuries. And I think the critical thinking, I understand this way, a way for us to develop a more elaborate ability to deal with, in your understanding, hallucinations, or with new forms of production, which are not true, not lies, and not even fiction in the traditional way, because fiction is declared as such, as attributed to someone. What we are dealing with is something new.
Okay, thank you. I have a question because I find your argument convincing to move from artificial intelligence to artificial communication. But where does that leave us as communication and media scholars? Is it only on the output side then? So we can be dealing with the output that these systems generate, or shouldn't we as media and communication scholars and also investigate the technical systems and look at data extraction or other forms of extraction, for instance, that kind of are necessary for these systems to work?
Yeah. Yeah, of course you are right. That's called the issue of STS kind of research. It looks like we have to look at the machines that play a role. Of course, they play a huge role. But, you know, I declared this was the beginning. I refer to Niklas Luhmann theory, and the machines are something that the idea is, of course, we can also, Luhmann communication concept starts from the receiver. Communication happens not when you produce something, you launch something, communication. If you write a wonderful book and remains in your drawer, it's not communication. It's communication when it is received, and the reception consider all these aspects, because completely different if you read a book produced by a printing press, or you use something from the mass media, the medium is a message, or how the way you interpret from your perspective, also the intention of the person producing the communication. So I don't think that these aspects have to be disregarded if you focus on communication as something which does not respect necessarily the thoughts of the person. Because of course, I always construct your thought when I try to answer your question. But I don't have any access to your thought. Everything I deal with is my way of interpreting your thoughts now in an interaction, but if we're written a different way. So everything is a way in which we produce meaning that gets circulating in communication.
So I have two more questions. I have two more questions on the list, Barbara, Thomas, and then there was another one? No? Yes, thank you. All right, and then I also close the list so that we finish mostly or a bit on time to have a break.
Okay, thank you for your speech. I have a question which refers to your previous answer. And this is to say that we, in short, should enhance or aim at enhancing the capacity, the competence of individuals then to deal with the differences, to distinguish what sort of information they got, how it is produced, and so on. And for me, this is a little bit as a prolongation, what we always did when we saw new problems of media production arising at the horizon or being in the middle of our society. And this is enhance the media competence. I'm saying this a little bit with this tone, enhance the media competence. We heard it too often, to be honest. And my question is, isn't this too much an individualization of the problems? And where would you go for answers which are more societal, which address more the political economic structure of the problem, which address, for example, ownership problems in the whole, and so on. So I'm not very comfortable with, after so long decades of giving media competence as an answer, with this sort of individualization of the problem.
Yeah, I agree. I think I can, if I understand it right, I can give a very short answer, because I very much agree with you. Well, I wouldn't use the term enhanced media competence, but if we're referring to that, it's not an individual problem, it's a social issue, and that concerns all these things that you're mentioning. I would never think enhanced individual competence. For example, media literacy is not a solution. It's not the point that you have competence taught in school and so on. It's a much broader thing that in many cases happen by itself. I observe now, I'm not a digital native, and I see how huge the difference it is. My daughter has a relationship with the media which is completely different from me. Even if I'm working with media all the time, there's something that becomes also not trained as such. And it does, to put this shortly, I agree. It doesn't concern the engagement of a single individual. It is a competence concerns political, economical, issues as well. Not only the individual, how the things are shaped in our social communication.
Thank you.
Ja, ich würde die Frage gerne auf Deutsch stellen. Ich bin sehr erfreut, dass du die Theorie sozialer Systeme... Ja.
Where are you? Okay.
Also ich bin sehr erfreut, dass du die Theorie sozialer Systeme so kreativ weiterentwickelst und damit zeigst, wie hochaktuell sie ist. Das will ich nochmal betonen, weil sie gerne manchmal als tot erklärt wird. Meine Frage geht dahin, kommt in den öffentlichen Debatten über ChatGPT, AI und so weiter nicht nur eine Angst vor dieser Technologie zum Ausdruck, sondern auch eine Kränkung, dass wir eben nicht mehr allein sind, dass die Medien oder die AI sogar unsere Intelligenz überflügeln kann.
Soll ich auf Deutsch antworten? Oder versuchen? Ja,
Gerne.
ich versuche. Ja, Ihre Sorge über Systemtheorie teile ich schon, ne? Dass wir darüber dann in Coffee Break sprechen. Aber wenn überhaupt, ich glaube, dass die Theorie sozialer Systeme nicht die Theorie, die sich sorgen über diese, ja, das in der, ja, ich meine, jetzt, wo ich gesagt habe, ich arbeite mit Systemtheorie, ich verstehe seit Jahrzehnten nicht, warum Kommunikation immer noch auf die Kompetenz, wenn nicht also auf die Gedanken der Menschen bezogen wird. Und ja, diese Sorge, ich habe keine Erklärung. Bei mir ist diese Sorge über den Wettbewerb zwischen diesen Tools und unserer Intelligenz. Ich habe gesagt, das macht mir keine besondere Sorge. Es sind andere Sachen, die mich interessieren.
Danke.
All right, thank you. So I think with that keynote and also now the questions, the scene is set very well for the whole conference, especially also with this discussion about how to deal with these challenges in terms of how to develop the capacities, the individual, but also the institutional capacities to this, let's call it maybe the complex alignment problem from both ends to deal with these challenges. And with that, thanks a lot to you, Elena, for kicking us off.
Thank you.
Und die Tagung geht weiter um 11 Uhr drüben in dem GW2-Gebäude, dort, wo Sie auch eingecheckt haben. Und ihr, 11 Uhr, wer kein EduRoam-WLAN-Zugang hat, geht bitte ins Tagungsbüro. Da können wir euch versorgen, mit anderen Wegen ins Internet zu kommen.